Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. And today we're going to talk to a gentleman by the name of Bill Smoot about a book that I find most unusual. The title of the book, what a marvelous title it is, Bill. Conversations with Great Teachers. Bill Smoot wrote it. Indiana University Press published for us, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
The reason why I find the book most unusual is its scope. But before I get to that, it's a book written, I would say, in the spirit of Studs Terkel's work.
Very much. He was my mentor in that way. I was actually a graduate student in Chicago back in the 70s, and he was a Chicago-based radio journalist. So when some of his books came out, like Division Street, and I think the one that actually sold best was Working,
yes.
I found them fascinating. It was sort of a real populist way to understand America, and I felt I learned more about the society by reading his books of interviews than I did reading any number of books of sociology.
And I'm sure you're not the only one.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
And so over the years, I actually used to think to myself, gee, I wonder when he's going to do a book of interviews with teachers. You know, I'd been a teacher all of that time. My mother was a teacher. And when I heard that he was in failing health and would write no more books, suddenly this idea popped into my head, what if I were to try to do one myself? And I think at that point, I probably heard my late mother's voice in my head. One of her favorite sayings was, if you really want something done, do it yourself. So with the audacity of an amateur, I just found a couple of teachers and started, thinking I might find it interesting. And after the first few, to me, it was more than interesting. It was fascinating. I was hooked.
Well, what came out of this inspiration from your mother and Studs is a book with conversations. It consists of 10 sections, all the way from teaching in the schoolroom, teaching athletes, out to teaching the protectors of society, FBI and policemen and stuff like that, teaching politicians how to be good politicians. And it encompasses conversations with 51 great teachers. Now, the thing that fascinates me is you also have a teaching job down in Palo Alto.
Right.
At a private school?
Yes, the Castellea School.
Okay, so you've got what I assume to be a full-time job.
I've got a day job, yes. and a night job.
These teachers are all around the country, I discovered.
Yes.
So how did you do this?
Well, I realized early on that if I interviewed them all in person, it would break the bank. So I thought, I wonder how a phone interview would work. And when I got the idea, I was a little skeptical. I thought nothing can substitute for, in the flesh, one-on-one conversation of the sort we're having now.
Yeah.
But actually, the phone conversations went much better than I thought. There's almost an advantage in that you're completely focused on the sound of the voice and what that person is saying. So I found that in some ways it almost concentrated my attention and my focus as it did theirs. And so I taped the interviews over the phone, and that part of the book really went well. Now, there were some people who let it be known when they were contacted that they really weren't open to that, or that they'd prefer an interview in person.
In particular, I remember one woman who said, I don't do this.
Well, the one I was thinking of was Martin Landau, the actor. And it was such a treat to go down and spend the day with him. He was a warm, open, generous man. I thoroughly enjoyed that day. Emil Jones, one of the political mentors for Barack Obama, who was based in Chicago, didn't want to do a phone interview. So I flew to Chicago and actually did a few in that area.
Good.
So there was some travel, but most of the people outside of Northern California I interviewed on the phone.
The central question of your interviews, I believe, is what do great teachers say about their teaching?
Mm-hmm.
And I think additionally, or implied in that is, and what can that teach us?
Right.
And you found, although you've done all different kinds of people, several things in common. And one of the first things that I remember is teaching is not a job.
Right.
Teaching is a calling.
Absolutely.
And I think that's extremely important to understand, you know. And the other thing is that teachers care very much about their students, and they try as much as they can to see them and treat them as individuals.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot going on in that classroom besides the transferal, which they would hate for me to use that word, of knowledge or information. Conversations with Great Teachers covers it all, from Socrates' dialogues to something called the teaching gene. The teaching gene? Stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Jim Foster of Conversations on the Coast, and one of the things we do here with perhaps too much frequency coming out of a break is that we talk about blurbs, what people have said good about the book that we're talking about. And but I've found out that in this business there are blurbs, and then there are blurbs. Jay Matthews is a fellow who makes his living as the Washington Post educational columnist. And here's what he says about conversations with great teachers. I have spent most of my adult life talking to great teachers. Every one of those interviews has been a delight. Read this fine book, and you can get the same thrill. Now, that's good stuff. That's good stuff. And it has a feeling of authenticity to it. That's great. Mm-hmm. Congratulations.
Thank you. And it was a great thrill to do the interviews. I mean, I feel truly blessed to have been able to do this book.
Good. Now, this is a very contemporary and up-to-date book. It's the only book around that I know of that has an educational theory that it involves people having something in their gene structure to make it possible. Now, this was brought forward by a fellow by the name of Craig Campbell, a teacher of psychiatric residence at UCSF in Fresno. In my mind, he says, there are people born with the skills to be a good therapist or a good teacher, and on top of that, you can learn. But there are people who just don't seem to have that gene, as you said. But teaching for me is very compelling. It's very fun. This came up in I think the gentleman that you studied with, Professor Gass.
Mm-hmm.
He said the same thing, that the big thing for him in the classroom is he's having fun.
Mm-hmm.
That's wonderful to hear.
Absolutely. And in a way, it's a paradox. I mean, it's true that many of these people are enormously generous and giving by their nature.
Mm-hmm.
Teaching is in some ways a helping profession, a giving profession. And yet you're absolutely right. It was also a kind of joy. And many of the people will say things like, I can't believe they pay me for this. It's so satisfying and so much fun.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. And the notion of pleasure comes up again with in your conversation with a gentleman by the name of John Faggi.
Oh, Faggi.
Mm-hmm. Okay. He's an English teacher in a prep school around here in Oakland. And he says, I want the kids to enjoy and appreciate and find pleasure. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a wonderful goal, it seems to me.
Mm-hmm.
I want to teach a kind of appreciation that makes them stop, a kind of slowing down. A good teacher, to do this, must have an authentic presence. And that's one of the other commonalities, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it goes with that sense of teaching as a calling. I mean, there was the first grade teacher in Minnesota whom I interviewed said that she felt teaching had chosen her. And you're right, there was that sense in all of these people that teaching was a calling. And I think it follows from that then as they become teachers, they feel that that's where they belong.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's almost as if
they're at home. This is
absolutely that's where they belong.
Now, this fellow who taught you, Professor Gass,
mm-hmm.
the philosophy professor, he's an amazing fellow.
He is. I mean, he's your listeners who follow the literary scene will know his work.
Yes,
he's a very celebrated essayist and fiction writer. And
won several national prizes.
Absolutely. And I remember him as probably the single best teacher I ever had, someone who really changed my life. And one of the things that's interesting about him is there are a lot of teachers in the book who talk about teaching as engaging students in doing things.
Mm-hmm.
And to read some of these interviews, you might think, well, this is an argument against the old lecture system, is it not? And I know there are some people in education who will often talk about lecturing as passive learning and so on.
Yep.
Well, Gass is the counterexample. I mean, his lectures were not passive to the people who heard them. I once said to someone, I mean, listening to his philosophy lectures was like taking LSD without the chromosome damage. You walked out of the lecture hall not the same person.
Yeah.
And it's simply not accurate to describe that as passive learning because the mind was engaged in a way that was enormously active.
And one of the things that he exhibits in his conversation is another thing that I would see as a kind of commonality, humility.
Absolutely.
He says what teaching really does, what does it really do? It really teaches the teacher.
Yes.
And I think anybody who's done any kind of teaching knows that
mm-hmm.
and has experienced it. And it's a wonderful experience.
Mm-hmm.
You go in thinking you know this and this and this. Pow. Comes that moment of exchange and interaction, and what you've known is enhanced.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So,
and one of the things that struck me is often when we read articles about teaching and so on, there's a certain emphasis on technique, and that's very important, and these people discuss that. But it's also true that these people seem to focus not so much on technique, but on the content of what they were teaching. They were experts in their field, and teaching was sort of an aspect of their expertise.
In Conversations with Great Teachers, Bill Smoot takes us anywhere good teaching is being done. The Marine Corps? Alligator wrestling farms? Oh, just stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
Yes, this is Jim Foster, and it is Conversations on the Coast. And I love it that today our book is called Conversations with Great Teachers. And I love having Bill Smoot alongside, giving us a chance to delve into this book, which he has created. I was going to say put together, but I thought creative was, more literary. But what you did was put it together.
Yes.
By running around and, doing a lot of stuff. It's amazing. It's amazing.
And in some ways for this book, I mean, I felt that I was more the midwife, in this case, than the mother, really giving voice to these 51 extraordinary human beings who teach.
It's interesting that people who've read it, who are in education, really appreciate it. and see it as having some kind of comprehensive message. For example, Bodhi Byzantine, who's the head of the Spence School in New York City, she says it's a wonderful lesson from the heart about teaching and faith, humanity, and passion. Mm-hmm. So that makes it, a book for everybody that, even though it's all these disparate 51 interviews, that it really holds together. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a great achievement. But it's also a great achievement for a man to deal with alligator wrestling and the U.S. Marines in a book on teaching. How do you do that, Bill?
Well, it evolved in that way. I mean, one of the quotes I've always liked is, the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, who said, "Man lives forward and knows backward." And in that way, I didn't know exactly where this book was going when I started doing it. And I could have done it just with a variety of teachers, including bad ones. That might have been interesting. But I decided to try to find great teachers. And then I also decided realized that teachers are not just confined to the classroom, the K through 12 school, or even the college classroom, that in some ways what any vibrant living society consists of, and in fact depends upon, is human beings passing on their knowledge and wisdom to other human beings. And so I think by the end, over half of the interviews in this book were not just in the traditional classroom, but were, the Marine Corps, the FBI Academy, the alligator farm, the ballet school, and so on.
Shooting a basketball?
Exactly. Because you're right, it is universal. There is something about, widely divergent kinds of teaching that nevertheless share things in common.
And one of the things that I think every one of these teachers would say is involved in good teaching is brought up in the book by Susan Moeller, a journalism professor at the University of Maryland, one of their special schools.
Right.
And it's the notion of performance quality. Mm-hmm. Performance quality. I'd like to quote from her.
Okay.
Every teacher has his or her own style, and you can only teach in your own style and be authentic. But there is a performance quality to being a good teacher, and you can't minimize its importance. Performance matters. It's the language you use, the speed with which you speak, the examples you choose. It's how you speak to or with the students. But I think above all, it's passion for the subject. I say that thinking about teachers I know, the best teachers are the ones who are able to communicate their passion about the subject to you. And then she follows that with a personal life example of she and, I guess, her husband going to an open school night.
Yes.
And a teacher saying, "I'm going to show you how to solve this algebraic equation." Mm-hmm. And they all sat raptly and listened and learned. Mm-hmm. So there it is, performance quality. Mm-hmm. That's there all the time, I guess.
I think so. I mean, insofar as teaching is part expression, you're right, it is a performance. And, of course, the other thing I think that her remark shows is that, and again, I think this was a common theme in the book, is that teaching is always in some ways meta-teaching. That is, you're not just teaching your particular subject,
right.
Like physiology or English or history. You're also teaching something about the nature of life, the nature of teaching, your own passion for the subject. And often that's what is remembered. I mean, people will say, I remember so well my 10th grade history teacher. I don't remember what he taught, but I remember how passionately he believed in democracy, or how much he cared about history, or how much he believed that unless you understood the past, you couldn't wisely go forward into the future. And so those meta lessons are an important part, I think, of what every teacher does.
The other thing that you've gotten by casting your, so large, is insights from places you wouldn't expect them, from your basketball shooting guy. I've been trained to realize and know that the student is the genius in this learning stuff, not me and my good ideas. Once you know that, coaching becomes easier, student-focused instead of coach-focused.
Absolutely.
And that's another commonality.
You're right.
The role of the student in all this.
And part of what every teacher does, I mean, obviously, teachers also give. They give knowledge and so on. But I think also the genius of the great teacher is drawing things out of the student and realizing that part of what needs to come to the surface is not the teacher's knowledge, but it's something in the student that the teacher helps to cultivate.
You know, Bill, I'm going to end this program with a truthful note. I wasn't sure when I've got this book that I should do it. I opened it, I began to read, and it made me begin to think about what you were just talking about moments in my education, moments that the content of which I can't remember, but something else is there still. And what a great possession that is. So this is a book. We've been talking about it. It's called Conversations with Great Teachers. It's by Bill Smoot, and you've been hearing about it on Conversations on the Coast.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at Jim Foster COC and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.